So I want to talk to you guys about a very fascinating question that has been on my mind, and that is on the Iraq War and the bombing of Libya, the NATO bombing of Libya. Why did the United States decide to topple Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi? And this is really an enigma. It's almost a mystery, really. We really can't grab onto the exact reason as to why these policies were done. They'll say, well, it was it was because Saddam Hussein had WMDs. Well, that turned out to be a lie, right? There's been all sorts of reports that have come out saying that was all a bunch of crap. Then they'll say, well, it was to establish a democracy. Like the United States really cares about establishing democracy when we are allies with Saudi Arabia. So that's also really a distraction, red herring. It's a bunch of crap. But then you have the other argument, which is, well, it was all for oil. And during the invasion of Iraq, there were two narratives that dominated political discourse when it came to that invasion. One narrative was for the conservatives, and it went something like this. Iraq has WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and Iraq could hit America. And then there was the other side, the other narrative, which was for the liberals, the anti-war activists, Democrats who hated George Bush. And it went something like this. It's all for oil. It's all just for oil. The reason why we're invading Iraq is to take their oil. So these were the two narratives. And these narratives dominated the discussion on Iraq. WMDs, democracy, it's all for oil, yada, yada, yada. But here's the thing. If it was all for oil, because we know the WMD thing was just a bunch of crap, democracy, that's a bunch of garbage, it's just crap. Like, the United States was protecting people from the Al-Mahdi army, and they were a bunch of Islamic despots who were killing people. It's just crap. Christians were very, very comfortable under Saddam, and then once he was gone, it's like, whoop, there was this huge exodus of the Christian population. They were all leaving because they didn't want to live in this, newly established democracy brought to you by the United States. So, America didn't care about democracy, didn't care about bringing order to that society. The United States was arming terrorists. How could you be for democracy and for, civilizing a society when you're arming terrorists? And Saddam Hussein was killing terrorists, and you got rid of him. So that doesn't make any sense. So you can throw that out the window. So then you have the whole argument of, well, it was all just for oil. Well, if it was really all just for oil, honestly, how much Iraqi oil is in the United States? These people act like, well, once we invaded Iraq, man, the pumps were stuck in the desert. We were just sucking all that oil out. And we were just bringing all that oil. And Exxon Mobil and all these big oil companies, they were just pushing for war, man. It's all just for the big oil companies, all for those petrodollars. But oil companies are interested in oil. It's not as though some big oil company owner got up and said, you know what, I really want to invade me a country. If oil companies could make deals with Saddam Hussein's regime and make billions of dollars as a result of that, then they'll do it. They don't care. How do I know this? Well, Gaddafi was described as a totalitarian, evil dictator who was a part of the axis of evil in the Middle East. As if you can even have an axis of evil in the Middle East. I don't know. Yeah, you have evil people in the Middle East. Yes, you have butcherers, you have mass murderers. Yes, absolutely. But the Middle East, axis of evil, some dictator living in a tent drinking black tea, not the thing you think about when you hear the term axis of evil. But anyway, that's a different discussion. So they'll say, well, Gaddafi was a part of this axis of evil. He was totalitarian, fascist, whatever. But the oil companies wanted to do business with his government. It's a very fascinating story. In the 1990s, big oil companies wanted to, they wanted to do business in Libya, and they were very successful in doing that. And Gaddafi was begging for American business. Gaddafi wanted American business. And he appointed some guy, I think his name was Saif al-Islam, and he was this big Libyan official, and he was working to get more Western industry involved in Libya to boost up the Libyan economy. Gaddafi, say what you want about him. He was living in his tent with his female bodyguards. He had his black tea and his turban. He had those sunglasses and that fro, and he had that long African attire, and he had that nice swag to him. Like, he wanted business, and he was very manageable. And so he was desperately wanting to have Western industry in Libya. And big oil companies were very happy to do business in Libya. And as a result, oil companies, American oil companies, got billions of dollars. They were French and there were French and Italian oil companies that were also getting very much so involved in Libya. And billions of dollars went into the Libyan economy. The oil companies, in fact, were the ones lobbying to get an American friendship with Libya established. It was the oil companies who were lobbying to get America to change its perspective on Libya. To say, hey, Libya isn't as bad. Gaddafi really isn't this bad, evil tyrant that we keep saying he is. It was the oil companies who were lobbying for this change of American policy in regards to Libya, and also to change America's perspective, because with the change of perspective comes a different policy. And so they were lobbying for the U.S. to have a more favorable and more positive view of Libya. The oil companies weren't sitting there saying, hey, we really want a war with Gaddafi. They weren't sitting there saying, hey, we really want a war with Saddam. Oil companies are interested in making money with oil. And there's something that I really want to read to you guys regarding the whole thing with oil. So John Mearsheimer, I read this book back in 2018. Excellent book. It's called The Israel Lobby by John Mearsheimer. Very, very fascinating book on the overreaching power of lobbyist organizations, specifically AIPAC and others. And it talks about the common statement of, well, Iraq was about oil. And John Mearsheimer disagrees with this. And he has a whole chapter in the book about why it really wasn't about oil. And there's one line in particular that I would like to read to you guys. He says, if Arab petrodollars or energy companies were driving American policy, one would expect to see the United States distancing itself from Israel and working overtime to get the Palestinians a state of their own. So the Arabs, traditionally, very anti-Israel, and they make a lot of speeches in support for the Palestinians. The Americans, more so on the side of Israel than the Palestinians. So if the Americans were all about the Arab petrodollars, if they were all about, protecting Saudi oil interest, then why don't they have a more favorable view for the Palestinians? Why does the United States constantly have a pro-Israel sentiment? That's another thing. And it goes on to say, countries like Saudi Arabia have repeatedly pressed Washington to adopt a more even-handed position toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but to little avail. And even wielding the oil weapon during the 1973 October War had little effect on U.S. support for Israel or an overall American policy in the region. Similarly, if oil companies were driving U.S. policy, one would also have expected Washington to curry favor with big oil producers like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, so that U.S. companies would make money helping them develop their energy resources and bringing them to market. Instead, the United States imposed sanctions on all three of these countries in sharp opposition to what the oil industry wanted. So the oil industry in the United States did not want the sanctions on these countries because the sanctions impeded economic earnings from these countries because, hey, there's sanctions on Iraq, Iran, Libya. Oil companies, American oil companies, can't do business with them. The French and the Italians were doing a lot of business with Libya. Italy has been one of Libya's biggest business partners historically. Historically, probably the biggest business partner of Libya. And once Saddam was gone, guess what the Italians and the French did? They went to Libya and started drilling oil and natural gas. Why? Because they wanted to protect their oil interests that they had there. But when Gaddafi was in power, they were doing that anyway. Like, they were getting the oil and the natural gas. Once Gaddafi was gone, it's like, hey, we have to protect our oil interests. We have to protect our natural gas interests. If Gaddafi were never removed, then the French and the Italians would still be working to protect their oil interest in that country. Like, they would still be pursuing their oil interest to make profit. So this whole idea of well, it was just for oil. Like, it's just for oil. That's the reason why, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't answer the question. It really doesn't answer the question. And so this is what leads me to say that these policies, the whole Middle East policy of the United States, of destabilizing the Middle East by removing these dictators, it really is an enigma. It's a mystery. Like, we really don't know the full reason as to why the United States toppled Saddam and toppled Gaddafi and invaded and bombed these countries, and with the case of Iraq, occupied it for a long time. We really don't know. It's like a horror movie. It's like a horror movie where you can't figure out what's happening, and then, later on, you finally realize it. It finally clicks in your brain. It's like that movie Hereditary, where in the beginning, you're like, okay, there's this cult, and the cult has this control, this, demonic control over this family. But then as the story goes on, you realize it's a lot more interesting. Like, you have the mom who's involved in the cult, and she's actually a witch, and it's just, the story opens itself up. And, nonfiction is a lot more fascinating than fiction. You meet all these people who are like, oh, I read novels. I read this novel. It's about, this guy who, married a wolf. Like, he marries a wolf, right? And, he's living in the wilderness, and it's like this, fictional historical period, and he's married to this wolf, but then there's a witch that pops up and makes the wolf into a beautiful woman, and he falls in love with her even more. But then the witch gets jealous and wants to take his heart. But the wolf, this female wolf, they fight to the death for the love of this guy, and it's this amazing story. But then the book's 3,000 pages, and it's 5 volumes. But I read all of them in a week. It's really amazing. People read, and I'm not I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but science fiction novels and fiction novels get really, really weird. And people get so stuck into them. They get so stuck into them. They get so entrenched by them. And it's why are you reading fiction? Oh, because it's really fascinating. You know what's even more fascinating and mysterious? Reality. Reality is way more fascinating and way more mysterious. And reality is also a lot more horrific and disturbing than any fiction novel or any film that you'll see. And that's what the Iraq War is like. That's what America's policy, NATO's policy of destabilization in the Middle East is like. It's like a horror movie, but it's worse because it's real. And there's a mystery in it. You really don't know why the US invaded Iraq. You really don't know why. People could say, well, the reason why we went into Libya, the reason why we got rid of Gaddafi is because, he was behind the Lockerbie bombing. But Gaddafi paid the compensation for that. There was some lawyer, his last name was Gerson, and he was representing the families of the victims of the Lockerbie bombing, and he said, well, we need $2.5 billion in compensation. And Gaddafi was like, I'll pay it as long as you lift the sanctions. And the US said, great, okay, do it. And Gaddafi paid the money. Gaddafi paid billions of dollars in compensation to the families of the victims of the Lockerbie bombing. And there were people in the US saying, wow, this is historic. An evil Middle Eastern totalitarian dictator, who lives in a tent and drinks black tea all day and has a weird hat. It looks like he's from the film Coming to America. Like, he's making this historic friendship with the United States. This is amazing. He paid the compensation. It's like, actually, no, he's really just a Middle Eastern political leader who was willing to negotiate and compromise in order to boost his interest and to protect his power. In other words, he's manageable. So the whole idea of, well, the reason why we bombed Libya, who's behind Lockerbie? Yeah, give me a break. Oh, it's because he had chemical weapons. Yeah, and he was working, or his regime was working with the IAEA, and the IAEA said, hey, Libya is actually following the rules, just like Iran. And the UN did the same thing with Saddam Hussein. Hey, Saddam Hussein actually got rid of a lot of his chemical weapons. He's complying by the rules. Oh, that doesn't matter. So that whole argument of, well, chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction, all that stuff, that's all just a bunch of crap. It's all just a giant distraction. So we can throw that out the window. So really, we're still stuck in this mystery. Why did this happen? There was a U.S. official who touched on this subject, actually. And this is coming from a chapter from this book, The Israel Lobby by John Mearsheimer. And he says this in a particular chapter here. He says, why did the United States invade Iraq? He begins the chapter with this question. Fascinating question. Because, there's this conventional idea, and people follow the conventional idea. Well, weapons of mass destruction, democracy, oil. But the question is actually very deep because we really don't know the answer. So he says, why did the United States invade Iraq? In The Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, George Packer declares that, quote, it still isn't possible to be sure. And this remains the most remarkable thing about the Iraq War. So he quotes this book on the Iraq War by George Packer, in which George Packer says, the most remarkable thing about the Iraq War is we don't know why we started the Iraq War. That's the most amazing thing about it. It's not Fallujah, it's not Ramadi, it's not the terrorists, it's not all of all the things that come from war, because those things are expected. The most remarkable thing about the Iraq War was that we don't know why the Iraq War started. And it says here, he quotes Richard Haas, the director of policy planning in the State Department during Bush's first term and now president of the Council on Foreign Relations, saying that he would, quote, go to his grave not knowing the answer. So this guy, Richard Haas, he was the director of policy planning in the State Department during the Bush administration, and it says here that he was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. So this guy, he's in the know. He's a U.S. official, and he said, I'm going to go down in my grave never knowing why the U.S. invaded Iraq. It's a big mystery. So we really don't know, but I'm going to try to explain. I'm going to gather the knowledge that I have and maybe put forth a reasonable theory as to why it all happened. Why did the United States decide to destabilize the Middle East? So now that we've established that, the WMD argument is crap, the oil argument is also crap, the democracy argument is obviously garbage, and we're left with a mystery. So why did it happen? We know for a fact that the United States knew that if they were to invade Iraq, that the chaos that would ensue as a result would overflow into Syria. I'm going to post a link to an article that I wrote on this. I don't remember everything that I wrote, but I remember the details. I don't remember the names, but there was a neoconservative guy who said that, and he said this before, he said this back, I think, in the 1980s, late 80s, And he said if we remove Saddam, the chaos that would spark as a result would overflow into Syria. And you would have a destabilization of the Middle East, essentially. And he said that there would be an immense amount of death, there would be a loss of life amongst the civilian population, but it doesn't matter because what's our priority? Our priority is America's interest in the Middle East. This is what this guy said. And he really reflected the neoconservative attitude. It doesn't matter how many people die. What matters is America's interest. And what did the destabilization of the Middle East cause, ultimately? What it caused was a migrant crisis. That's what it caused. It led to the deaths of over a million people in Iraq. Tons of people have already been killed in Libya, civilians. And, going back to the oil argument, if it was really about American interest in oil in Libya, you have Turkey, you have France, Russia, and Italy all getting natural gas and oil in Libya right now. So if America really just wanted to, it was about oil, then why did America do a policy that would eventually lead to Russia and Turkey and, countries that aren't America to get the natural energy resources of Libya? It's like, again, it doesn't make any sense. But the policy of the United States in Libya and Iraq and Syria, it caused a migrant crisis. And that migrant crisis is right now destabilizing the politics of Europe. When you start a war, there's one thing that you could always expect to happen, and that is a migrant situation. Anytime you have a war, people leave where they live. It's just the fact. You look at the violence that has been going on in Nigeria with Boko Haram and also with the all the oil gangs. Millions of people have left their homes in Nigeria. The fighting in Libya has caused the same thing. Iraq, Syria caused the same thing. The war in Ukraine caused a tremendous migrant situation. I think it was like 2 or 3 million Ukrainians left Ukraine as a result of the 2014 conflict with Russia. So if there's a war, you can always bet that there's going to be a migrant crisis or some kind of a migrant situation. We saw this also in the Balkans. Tons of people in the Balkans went to Western Europe because they wanted to escape the wars that were happening in Yugoslavia. So they knew by destabilizing the Middle East, they would cause a migrant crisis. And the migrant crisis has sparked a nationalist phenomena in Europe. This is a fact. The Golden Dawn in Greece is getting a lot of popularity because of its fight against the migrants. The Sweden Democrats, the AFD, the Forum for Democracy. I've said these titles a million times in my videos. You guys know. And the idea of sparking nationalism in Europe was in fact a major goal of NATO during the Cold War. And what did NATO do? They were arming terrorists, right-wing Nazis, and having them do terrorist attacks to only later on blame these terrorist attacks or attribute these terrorist attacks to the left, to communists. The point of this was to spark anti-communist nationalism in Europe. Now, the plan didn't really work. It failed, actually. Europe, during the Cold War, for the most part, remained in a centrist view of politics, be it center-right or center-left. And you had the Christian Democrats in Italy that were very popular, and you had that sort of thing. So it didn't work. And once the facts about Gladio were finally released to the public in the year 1990, the United States government claimed, well, that program has been shut down. And they shut it down supposedly in 1990. But I don't think that plan ever really died. I think it just remanifested itself in different ways. For example, the arming of the Taliban to kill off the Soviets, to kill off the Russians. The Taliban essentially are Islamic, fascist, despotic terrorists. And the United States was arming them. The arming of the Mujahideen. essentially the same thing as arming neo-Nazis. Not entirely the same thing ideologically, but in principle, it's very, very similar. So the policy never really died. It never really died. And so the United States, I believe, never really stopped this policy. You saw this also in Ukraine, with the United States backing Ukrainian nationalists against the Russians. Also, you saw this in the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, in which the United States and Germany were arming and backing and training the Kosovo Liberation Army, or the KLA, which consisted of literally Albanian neo-Nazis. So the United States didn't say, "Hey, we're going to stop arming and training and backing Nazis and terrorists." They continued on with it. So that policy didn't really change. Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Ukraine, you see this policy consistently being done. So if we go by the idea that the United States still wants nationalism to spark in Europe, then we can have a reasonable opinion, a reasonable suspicion that the United States still wants nationalism to spark in Europe, and that this migrant crisis is the perfect means by which to do this, the perfect means by which to materialize this goal, this objective. So in my opinion, in my suspicion, why did the United States invade Iraq, mess up Syria, and mess up Libya? It wasn't about WMDs, it wasn't about oil, and it wasn't about democracy. If it wasn't for these things, then what was it about? I think it was about causing destabilization in the Middle East, and by that, causing a giant torrent of political destabilization in Europe. I think ultimately that's what this was about. And you can connect the dots. You have the invasion of Iraq. Turkey gets very much so empowered by what's happening in Syria because the chaos overflows into Syria. Turkey wants to enter Syria. Russia sees what's going on and says, "Hey, I better take the Black Sea and invade Crimea." And so Russia invades Crimea, and then with that invades Ukraine, because Crimea was a part of Ukraine. And now you still have all this fighting happening in eastern Ukraine. It all connects. That's what's so fascinating. It all connects. The whole thing with the Middle East, the America's policy in Iraq and Libya, they're not isolated. These are policies that have ripple effects that inundate into Europe, into other continents. And so from America's destabilization of the Middle East, you had the migrant crisis. From the migrant crisis, you have now a nationalist uprising taking place. And with that, you have what NATO wanted this whole time. And that's why I think the United States invaded Iraq, Libya, and Syria. That's why I think the United States destabilized the Middle East. It was to cause a spark of chaos that would ripple into Europe, and from there cause an escalation that will eventually lead into something even more destructive. Anyway, I've been talking enough. Hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.